She didn't beg. She offered herself, quiet, steady, under the scorching eyes of a town that saw her as less than human. "One night," she said, "so my daughter can eat." Men laughed. A woman whispered, "Savage." And the sheriff called her a problem to be removed. But then, one man stepped forward. He didn't draw a gun. He gave her bread and made the town choose which side of the dust line it stood on. Mesa Amarga. Late afternoon. The sky over Mesa Amarga was the color of old bruises, yellowed, cracked, and close. Dust gnawed at Silas Thorne's throat as he walked his horse the last stretch into town. The animal had stumbled twice on the deep ruts, and Silas's own legs ached from the ride. He wasn't here to be noticed. Just salt, flour, and a new hinge for the barn. Winter was coming fast, and he aimed to be ready before the snow started crawling down from the hills. But the moment his boots hit the boardwalk outside Crawford's store, the air changed. Everything stopped. A strange silence swallowed the street. He turned. She stood by the tie post, young, Apache, hollow-eyed, wrapped in a buckskin dress worn to threads, one arm across her chest, the other holding tight to a child no more than 4, whose fingers clung to her skirts like they were the last rope between her and the earth. No one helped. No one moved. The woman licked her cracked lips, swallowed, and said, loud enough to split the silence, "Please, buy me for one night. My daughter is hungry." 2 men on the saloon porch chuckled. One, Jed, leaned forward and spat. "Should have asked me first, sweetheart. I'd have taken you for nothing." Across the way, old Agnes Cartwell muttered to her friend, voice like vinegar, "Savages breed like rabbits." Sheriff Pike pushed through the saloon doors with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "Vagrancy ain't tolerated," he barked. "Get her gone." The woman, later he'd learn her name was Tala, dropped her eyes. The girl pressed tighter to her side, trembling, and no one moved. So Silas did. He stepped forward, not fast, not loud, just firm, just present. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low but carrying. "Tala," she whispered, "and my daughter's Nima." He said nothing more. Reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a cloth-wrapped hunk of bread and offered it. Tala looked at it like it might explode. But slowly, she took it. Tore it in half. The first piece went to the girl, who ate too fast, then slowed, chewing careful, as if the food might vanish. Only after Nima finished did Tala take a bite. Her hands shook. Sheriff Pike scowled. "You taking 'em, Thorne?" Silas didn't answer. He moved forward, gently lifted Nima into his arms, then offered a hand to Tala. She flinched, expecting roughness, but his hands were steady, not claiming, just safe. He helped her up, shrugged off his duster, and wrapped it around the girl. "You watch yourself, Thorne," Pike shouted as they turned down the street. "Ain't wise picking up strays." Silas didn't look back. "Risk's worth taking," he said, barely above a whisper. The town shrank behind them, a smear of bitterness in the dust. Tala held her daughter close. She didn't speak, just watched the man who had power, and took nothing. After a while, she said, voice brittle but proud, "You never answered my offer." Silas kept walking. No mother should have to trade herself for food, not anywhere. She looked down at Nima, brushed crumbs from her face. "Thank you," Tala murmured. The words sounded foreign on her tongue. Nima stirred and whispered, "I'm still sad, but I'm not hungry." Silas felt something shift behind his ribs. "You'll rest at my place," he said. "Then you choose what comes next." The plains opened wide and silent around them. The shadows of 3 exiles stretched long in the setting sun. A broken man, a starving woman, and a child who had forgotten what warmth felt like. But tonight, the fire would burn again. If that moment hit you right in the chest, then stick around. Because this isn't just a rescue. It's the start of a story where found family, dignity, and quiet defiance mean more than bullets or blood. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. The fire inside the cabin crackled steady, but the cold outside pressed its face to the windows like a beggar who'd never stop knocking. Silas Thorne sat near the door, one hand on his rifle, boots planted wide, his eyes not closed, just lowered, resting but never off guard. Across from him, Tala curled around her daughter like a second skin. Nima, now warm, fed, and blanketed, had fallen into the first true sleep a child should know. Not from exhaustion, but safety. And Tala? She hadn't cried. Not yet. But her shoulders had lowered, if only a little. Silas didn't speak much. Men like him, weather-worn, soul-scarred, rarely did. But everything about the way he sat told her what kind of man he was. The kind who didn't say, "You're safe." The kind who made it so. The morning came with grit in the air and frost on the inside of the glass. Silas was already outside, splitting logs with the calm repetition of a man who found peace in doing things that made sense. Wood, axe, muscle, swing. No politics, no lies. Inside, Tala stirred from her spot on the floor. Her back ached, but not like before. This was a clean ache, the ache of shelter, not survival. She tucked the blanket tighter around Nima and moved quietly to the window. Watching him work, the sharpness of each movement, the clean way he stacked the wood, how he didn't waste time checking to see if she was watching. She thought of her late husband, Koda, who'd once built a lean-to for her with bare hands and fire in his eyes. The memory pinched, but it didn't burn like it used to. When Silas came back in, shaking the snow from his coat, Tala handed him a tin mug of hot water. Their fingers brushed, just for a second, but the contact felt louder than any word. He took it, said nothing, but nodded once, and that was enough. "You always live like this?" she asked, not out of small talk. She hated that. But because she needed to understand what kind of man had carried her and her daughter away from judgment without asking for a damn thing. Silas set the mug down. 6 years. Then, with a shrug, "Land don't lie to you. People do." Tala nodded. She understood that more than most. "The people turned me out," she said, her voice flat, though her chest tightened at the telling. "No man to speak for me, no food, just silence and looks that said I should have died with him." Silas didn't react, but the grip on the mug in his hand tightened. "They had no right," he said after a beat. She blinked. That wasn't the response she expected. "It doesn't matter anymore," she added quietly. "What was is gone. What is here." She looked toward the cot where Nima still slept, hair like tangled ink across her face. Silas didn't say more, but the space between them felt less like distance now, more like something being built, slowly, with wood and fire and quiet trust. Later that day, as Silas prepared to hunt, he turned to her before stepping out. "If anything feels wrong, if the wind shifts, if the dog barks, if the mare gets uneasy, you bolt the door and wait. I'll be close." Tala nodded. "I will." His eyes lingered on Nima, then on Tala. He hesitated, like a man on the edge of saying something personal and deciding not to. Then he stepped into the cold, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Alone again, Tala moved like someone who'd once lived in peace, but forgot what it tasted like. She cleaned what little there was to clean, checked the windows twice, and folded the blanket that had kept Nima warm. The girl woke slow and sleepy, rubbing her eyes, and without saying a word, looked around the room. Not in fear, but in recognition. She was looking for Silas. That small gesture hit Tala in the chest like a slow hammer. He'd been here a day, and already her daughter trusted him. Outside, the wind shifted. Cold. Sharp. Tala's spine stiffened, not from the temperature, but from something else. An instinct, one she hadn't ignored in years. She pulled Nima close, checked the door latch, and held the poker from the fire like it was a blade. No knock came, but no peace either. When the door did rattle, it was soft. 3 knocks. Even. Not the knock of danger. Silas stepped through, snow on his coat and a rabbit in hand. His eyes scanned the room like he expected trouble, then softened when he saw the tension in her stance. "You felt it," he said. "The wind changed," she whispered. "You did right." And for the first time, Tala didn't lower her eyes. She looked straight at him. Not in challenge, in recognition. They were the same kind of broken. They cleaned the rabbit together. He taught, she listened. And the cabin filled with the slow sounds of something unfamiliar to both. Rhythm. Outside, the wind clawed at the world. Inside, the heat held. And the line Silas Thorne had drawn in the dust back in Mesa Amarga? It wasn't just for show. It was a promise. The snow came whispering in the dark, soft at first, then steadier. By the time dawn pressed its gray hand against the windows, the world outside had turned to pale silence. Silas rose before the light fully broke. He moved without speaking, pulling on his coat, checking the door latch, stirring the coals. The kind of man who didn't need an alarm because his body had learned the rhythm of hard years and colder mornings. Tala was already awake, watching him from her corner, her arms wrapped protectively around Nima, who slept curled like a kitten beneath the blanket. She hadn't said much after the storm rolled in. There hadn't been need. In that little cabin, silence wasn't punishment. It was respect. "You sleep at all?" Silas asked, voice low. "Some," she replied. He nodded. No follow-up, no fuss. He wasn't the kind to talk in circles. Outside, he opened the door to a world muffled in white. The corral was quiet, the fence posts buried in drifts. He exhaled slow. This was the kind of snow that didn't just blanket land. It buried problems, and sometimes unearthed new ones. Back inside, Tala stood and began folding the blankets, not because anyone asked, but because it was who she was. "I can take care of the fire," she said. "I know," he answered, handing her a small bundle of kindling. "And I'll need to check the traps today." She hesitated. "Alone?" "Safer," he said simply. "If you leave this land, you leave the rules that protect you." Her jaw clenched slightly, but she didn't argue. There was no insult in his words, only truth. After breakfast, dry bread, boiled beans, and what remained of the salt pork, Silas pulled on his coat again, rifle slung across his back. "Wind's shiftin'," he said. "Might bring more than snow." Tala met his eyes. "What kind of more?" "Men who see storms as cover, or excuse." He paused. "Keep the door barred. Bolt it if the dog barks. You see anyone who ain't me, you wait them out. Don't answer unless I knock. 3 times. She nodded once. "And if they don't leave?" Silas looked down for a beat, then back at her. "You do what you have to, but I won't be far." Then he was gone. Boots crunching through fresh powder, shoulders squared, disappearing into the white. The hours passed slow. Tala kept Nima busy with quiet games, melting snow on the stove, tracing the fog on the window panes with tiny fingers. There was a peace in the repetition, but it wasn't a peace Tala trusted yet. Stillness was too often the prelude to disaster. Around midday, Nima looked up and whispered, "Is he coming back?" Tala smiled, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. He said he would, and somehow that promise, unspoken but solid, felt more real than most she'd heard in her life. But just as the sun hit its highest point behind the clouds, something shifted. The dog, tied near the barn, let out a low growl. Not panicked, just warning. Tala froze. She moved quickly, scooping Nima into her arms, tucking her into the blanket near the stove. She grabbed the fire poker, the only real weapon within reach. Her hands were steady, the kind of steadiness born not of courage, but of knowing what danger tastes like. Then, footsteps. Soft, deliberate, someone approaching the door. Her breath caught in her chest. 3 knocks. Even. Slow. Relief collapsed her knees slightly. She opened the door to Silas, covered in snow, rifle in one hand, a string of rabbits in the other. "You locked it," he noted. "You told me to." His lips twitched, maybe the start of a smile, but it didn't quite reach the surface. "You felt it too," she said. "The wind's been wrong all morning." He stepped in, stamping snow from his boots. He didn't ask if she'd been afraid. He didn't need to. "You did right," he said. That evening, after the fire was restoked and the meat hung to dry, the 3 of them sat around the stove. Nima leaned against her mother, half asleep, whispering something about the horse in the barn. "She hasn't said a word since we were turned out," Tala said, watching her daughter's lips move. "Not really. She stopped because it was safer." "She can talk here," Silas said firmly. "No one will punish her for being a child." Tala's throat tightened, but she nodded. Then she asked something she hadn't dared before. "Why did you step in, back in town?" He stirred the fire, jaw working. "I've seen enough men stand by while someone got crushed." He didn't elaborate. Didn't need to. "You don't even know us." "I didn't need to," he said. "You were cold, hungry. I don't care what townfolk think." She looked at him, long and quiet. The fire popped between them. "Neither do I anymore." That night, the snow kept falling. But inside, something softer had started to take root. It wasn't safety. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something close. The wind had died by nightfall, but the cold stayed. The kind that didn't need to shout to be felt. It crept in under door frames and into bones that had lived too many winters. But inside the small cabin, the fire burned steady. Wood crackled. Meat simmered. And silence, not sharp, not brittle, but warm, settled like a heavy quilt across the room. Silas sat by the stove, carving a strip of leather. Not for any reason. Just to keep his hands from fidgeting. He wasn't used to quiet like this, not with company. Tala had finally sat down across from him, Nima curled into her side like a pup drawn to warmth. The girl had eaten well. Too well, probably, and now slept heavy, her lips parted slightly, her breath calm. She looked smaller in rest, younger than the world had forced her to act. "You always sleep with your boots on?" Tala asked softly, her eyes on his feet. Silas glanced up, one brow lifting. "Used to." She didn't push, just nodded, like someone who understood that comfort was something you unlearned before you learned it again. They hadn't talked much since dinner. Silas had kept to himself, and Tala, though grateful, hadn't let down her guard entirely. She'd moved with grace, but always from the corner of her eye, like someone used to being watched too closely. But tonight was different. Maybe it was the way Nima had whispered, "Thank you," before falling asleep, her small fingers still holding tight to the edge of Silas's coat. Maybe it was how Tala, after weeks of only acting from necessity, sat now with her spine no longer stiff like a soldier's. Or maybe it was the quiet, not just absence of sound, but the kind that made a person listen inward. "Fire's hot," she said, nodding toward the stove. "More than we're used to." Silas poked the embers. "No good sleeping cold if you don't have to." "You think we'll be warm tomorrow?" He glanced over. "Might snow harder. Storm's waiting its turn." Tala's gaze drifted to the window, where the glass had fogged with steam and breath, a blurred mirror between two worlds. "I can clean," she said suddenly. "In the morning. The shelves, the tools. Wash the floor, too." "You don't owe me work. I'm not paying," she said. "It's just who I am." That made Silas pause. He met her eyes, not out of suspicion, but respect. "Then I won't stop you." She nodded. A truce of sorts. Minutes passed. The kind of minutes where two people sat close enough to hear each other breathe, but far enough that neither had to explain anything they didn't want to. Then Tala asked, "Why here?" Silas set the leather down. "You mean this place? This cabin? This land? This life?" He leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His voice, when it came, was rough like a fence post left too long in the sun. "Because the dead don't talk out here." Tala said nothing. Not out of fear, out of understanding. "I was a scout once," he added. "Army didn't care how far we rode, so long as we didn't come back empty. I got tired of finding death and pretending it meant something. And now? Now I fix fences, hunt rabbits, don't wait for orders." Tala looked down at Nima's sleeping face. "That sounds like peace." Silas shook his head slowly. "Ain't peace. It's quiet. There's a difference." She didn't argue. Instead, she reached down and pulled the blanket tighter around Nima's shoulders, her hand lingering there a moment. Then, without thinking, she spoke. "My husband's name was Koda. He died last winter. Fever took him fast. My people said there was no place for a woman alone. No protection, no food, just silence." Silas didn't flinch. "That ain't your shame." It felt like it. He nodded once, slow and sure. "The world's got enough cruel in it without folks adding more." Outside, the snow began again, soft, like dust on a coffin lid. Inside, Tala reached down and pulled the coat Silas had wrapped Nima in higher up the girl's chest. Then she looked up at him. "You sleep. I'll keep the fire." He hesitated, then gave her a look, half question, half trust. "You sure? I've done it colder, and with less wood." Silas chuckled once, deep in his chest. It wasn't amusement, just a sound shaped like relief. He stood, stretched, and then, instead of laying on the cot, settled in the chair near the door, rifle leaning close. Boots still on, hat low. "You watching the door?" she asked. "Always." A long breath passed between them. "Good," Tala said. "I'm watching the fire." And with that, the night unfolded slow, warm, and wordless. Two strangers, one child. And for the first time in a long time, no one expected anything to be taken. The morning came hushed, wrapped in a silver fog, snow blanketing the hills in silence. The kind of silence that didn't just quiet sound, but memory. Inside the cabin, warmth still lingered in the stove, and Nima was still curled where she'd fallen asleep, wrapped in Silas's old coat like it belonged to her. Tala moved first. She always did. She cleaned out the pot from the night before, swept the floor, folded every blanket with the kind of care that made them feel like something earned, not given. When Silas stepped in from chopping wood, he paused on the threshold. Snow clung to his collar. The axe in his hand dripped from melting frost. "Coffee's hot," Tala said without looking. He set the axe down slow. "Appreciate it." He moved quiet, but Tala could still feel the weight of him in the room, the kind of presence that settled in the floorboards. She handed him a tin cup, and their fingers touched, barely. But it was enough. Their eyes locked, just for a breath. Neither flinched, neither smiled. But something shifted. Later, Silas readied his rifle. "I'll need to check traps by the ridge. Won't be long." Tala stood by the door, hands on her hips. "You said we'd stay off other men's land? This ain't their land, but it's close." She nodded once. "Want me to come?" "No." He softened it after a pause. "You stay. Bolt the door. Keep her close." She didn't argue, but she did watch him, really watch him, as he stepped out into the wind again. That's when she noticed it, how he looked back, just once before the trees took him. Inside the cabin, the rhythm resumed. Tala gathered Nima's dress to mend a seam. The girl sat at her feet, running 2 wooden pegs along the floor, calling them horses in a whisper. "Can we stay here?" Nima asked, her voice small. Tala paused her stitching. "For now." "Will he stay too?" That question made Tala freeze. "He lives here, baby." Nima thought that over, then nodded. "Good." Just that. Nothing more. But it stayed with Tala like a stone in her chest. The wind picked up by midday. Tala stepped outside just far enough to check the line where she'd hung damp linens. The snow had eased, but clouds still loomed, thick and gray like bruises. A raven called once from the tree line. Her stomach tightened. She moved quick, back inside, locking the door, setting Nima near the stove with a slice of bread and checking every window twice. No sound. No tracks. But she knew better than to wait for proof. She reached for the iron poker and held it across her knees as she sat, every part of her tense but still. Then, footsteps, soft, crunching snow, 3 knocks. She stood, heart caught between memory and instinct. Then opened the door. Silas. Snow dusted his hat, a rabbit in one hand, rifle slung behind him. "You came back fast," she said. "Didn't feel right staying long? Wind's turning again?" He stepped in, scanned the room, and paused on her face. "You felt it?" Tala nodded. Didn't see anyone, but something changed. He looked toward the windows. "You did right. Always trust it." That word, always, stayed in the air like wood smoke. They cleaned the rabbit together, working in quiet sync. Nima sang to herself softly while she played, her small voice mixing with the bubbling of water and the hiss of fire. Tala glanced at Silas once, his sleeves rolled, his jaw tight as he worked the blade down the bone. "You ever live with anyone?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Not for long." "She left." More like, "I left first." Never said it. But she wanted a man who didn't carry ghosts. "I never figured out how to put mine down." Tala kept folding the shirts. "Some ghosts don't leave. They just sit quieter if you feed them right." That got a look from him, not surprised, but seen. As evening fell, Silas fed more wood to the fire. Nima dozed in her corner, warm and full. Tala leaned by the door, arms crossed. "She trusts you." "She don't know me." "She knows enough." Silas's voice dropped. It's been a long time since someone looked at me like that. She's a child. She don't see your shadows. She should. No, Tala said. She shouldn't. And for the first time, Silas sat down, not in his usual chair by the door, but closer, between them and the world. Not a sentry, just a man. Trying. By morning, the thaw had turned the snow to slush, and every footprint told a story. Silas was the first to see it, half-buried tracks leading off from the ridge. Not his, not hers. Heavy, uneven. 2 men, maybe 3, moving slow. Watching. He didn't say anything right away, but when he returned, his jaw was locked tight, and his eyes didn't rest in one place for long. Tala knew. Something had changed. That evening, she was ladling rabbit stew into bowls when she said, calm and low, "You saw them." Silas didn't look up. "Yeah." "Close?" "Too close." She set the ladle down and walked to the window, looking past the frost. "How long before they come?" Silas rubbed a hand over his face. "Could be a day, could be less. Depends what they want. Could be they're just passin'." Tala turned toward him, her voice flat. "Men like that don't pass." He didn't argue. They ate in silence, save for Nima's small hums between spoonfuls. But even she felt the change in the air. After dinner, Tala tucked her daughter in with extra layers, kissing her forehead and whispering something in Apache. Soft, rhythmic, like a spell against the dark. Silas stood by the door, his rifle close. "You expect me to stay inside?" she said. He nodded. "For her sake, yeah." She crossed her arms. "And if I don't?" He looked her square in the eye. "Then we fight side by side. But if I fall, someone needs to get her out." Tala didn't blink. "I don't run anymore." "That's not what I know what you meant." Her voice dropped. "But you don't get to make that call. Not for me." They stared at each other, the fire popping low behind them. Then Silas nodded once, respectful. All right. By dawn, Silas had dug out the old saddle holster he hadn't touched in years. The leather was cracked, the buckles stiff, but it still fit. He set 2 extra rifles by the stove and packed jerky, matches, and a skin of water into a bag. Tala watched him from across the cabin. "You think it's today?" "Feels like it." He strapped the bag shut. "You ever shoot?" She didn't answer, just stepped forward, took the rifle from his hands, and checked the chamber like it was second nature. He gave a half smile. "Good." They spent the day reinforcing the cabin. Silas boarded the windows tight, but left narrow gaps to see through. Tala boiled water, lined jars across the sill, and laid a carving knife under the pillow. Every few hours, she'd check on Nima, still asleep under the quilt, her breath even. But each time, her eyes lingered longer on the child's face, as if she were memorizing it. It wasn't until late afternoon that the riders came. They didn't ride fast, didn't need to. 2 of them. Coats dusted with snow, wide hats pulled low. One had a red bandana, the other a limp in his left leg. Tala saw them first from the loft window. "They're here," she said. Silas moved beside her, his breath steady but cold. The riders stopped maybe 40 yards from the cabin. One dismounted, slow and showy, brushing snow from his boot like he owned the land. He called out, voice oily and too cheerful. "Heard there's a squaw and a girl been hiding up this way, looking to collect what's owed." Silas opened the front door just enough to speak. "Ain't nothing here for you." The man laughed. "That's where you're wrong. That girl belongs to a man who paid good cattle for her." Silas's voice dropped. "Then he bought himself a grave." There was a pause. Then gunfire. Not much, just a warning shot. A bullet tore through the upper corner of the porch, splintering wood. Tala pulled Nima tighter to her chest, whispering words in her ear, shielding her body like stone. Silas fired back once, not to hit, to answer. The riders retreated for now, but the message was clear. They'd be back, and next time, they'd mean it. That night, the cabin stayed dark. No fire, no talk, just the breath of 3 people and the sound of snow melting off the roof. Tala whispered, "You don't have to keep doing this, not for us." Silas didn't answer right away, then said, "I don't reckon I'm doing it for you anymore." She turned her head. "Then why?" He looked at her. Real. Bare. "Because I want to." The sky turned heavy that morning, not with snow, but with silence. The kind that presses against your ribs and makes a man hold his breath without knowing why. Inside the cabin, Silas rolled up the worn map of the ridge, his hands grimy with dirt and sap. He'd set traps overnight, just in case they circled wide. Taylor had stayed up, watching the horizon like it owed her a debt. Neither said it, but they both knew. The men weren't done. They were the kind that hunted slow, the kind that liked fear to do half the work. Nima was up early, sitting cross-legged by the cold hearth. She was humming something soft and old, tracing patterns into the soot with her finger. Tala watched her daughter, heart twisted in ways no blade could match. "She don't know what's comin'," Tala whispered. Silas was oiling his rifle by the door. "She don't need to. That's the whole damn point." Tala nodded, but her eyes didn't soften. "She's too much like me." Silas gave her a look. "Could be worse." "How?" "She could be like me." They ate quietly. Biscuits and dried apples. No fire, no light. Just warmth from each other's nearness. When Nima dozed off again, wrapped in both their coats, Tala leaned close. "You ever been in a standoff before?" Silas grunted. "Used to be a soldier. Got plenty of scars to prove I wasn't good at ducking." She smiled faintly. "So we're not dying today?" He shook his head, dead serious. "Not if I can help it." That afternoon, wind swept through the trees like ghosts brushing past. The sun barely peeked behind clouds, and every creak in the pines felt like a footstep. Then the rider came. Alone. Silas spotted him first, a shadow moving deliberate through the trees. Red bandana. Same man as before. He rode slow, like someone who didn't care how close he got. Silas loaded his rifle. Tala moved to the window. "It's just one." "Which means the others ain't far." The rider stopped at the edge of the clearing and called out, smooth as whiskey left in the sun. "Thought we might chat civilized. We don't want blood." Silas opened the door just enough for his voice to carry. "Then turn around." "I came to talk." "You came to claim a child like she's cattle." The man chuckled. "Ain't about what she is. It's who she belongs to. That's a man you don't want trouble with." Tala stepped beside Silas, her voice sharp as flint. "Then he shouldn't have traded a soul for a sack of grain." There was a beat of silence. Then the man said, quieter, "Tell you what. You give her up, and we forget this whole cold mess. You don't, and this place goes up before morning." Silas raised his rifle. "You try it, and you'll be the one burnin'." The rider smiled, tipped his hat, and turned. He didn't need to threaten again. The message had settled deep. They had, until nightfall. Back inside, the quiet returned. Thicker now. Silas double-checked the window slits. Tala sharpened a blade on a whetstone with steady hands. Neither of them looked afraid. but both looked like they'd already buried parts of themselves to stay standing. At dusk, Tala lit a single candle and placed it near Nima, still sleeping. She brushed the girl's hair back and murmured a prayer, not to any god she could name, but to her ancestors, to the mountain, to the fire in her bones. When she turned around, Silas was watching her. "I ain't never had a reason to stay put before," he said. She stepped closer, her voice a whisper. "Now you do." Outside, branches cracked, boots in the snow, shadows forming. But inside, two hearts stood ready. Not because they were brave, but because they were done running. And in this cold, unforgiving land, sometimes that was the only thing that made a soul dangerous. The first shot cracked just after midnight, sharp, clean, and meant to stir fear more than draw blood. Silas didn't flinch. He was already at the front window, eyes scanning the dark stretch of pines. Snow drifted in sheets, glowing faint in the moonlight, blanketing the woods in a deceptive peace. But peace had nothing to do with what was coming. Tala pulled Nima close in the back room, her body wrapped around the girl like a second skin. The child trembled but didn't cry. Tala had taught her better than that. "Remember the rock, little one," she whispered in Apache, brushing snowflakes from her daughter's lashes. "What does the mountain do when the storm comes?" "It waits," Nima replied, barely audible. "Good." At the front, Silas loaded shells into his old repeater. His hands were steady, but his breath was short. This wasn't some frontier shootout with drunks and fools. This was a slow, cold bleed-out, the kind that took your soul in inches. A second shot rang out, this time closer. Then a third. Tala emerged from the back, knife at her belt, rifle slung over her shoulder. Her eyes burned. "3," she said, circling. "They want to flush us, smoke us out or scare us stupid." She knelt beside the window, sighting through the crack. "We ain't stupid," she said. Silas allowed himself a grim smirk. "Speak for yourself." They didn't speak much after that. Time passed slow and cruel, the kind that makes you question every breath. Outside, boots crunched snow in patterns that didn't match deer or elk. Shadows shifted between trees, one shape bending beside another, a whistle like wind but made by lips. Tala aimed and fired once. A yelp, then silence. One down. The next hour came fast. A fire arrow hit the roof. Silas snatched a blanket and beat it out before it caught. Another burst through the window, shattering glass. Tala shoved Nima beneath the table and dove for cover. Gunfire barked back and forth, echoing like thunder on canyon walls. The smell of powder mixed with pine sap and sweat. At one point, Silas caught a glimpse of a man behind the chicken coop. Red scarf, dark coat, the same one who'd spoken earlier. He fired. The man vanished. "You hit him?" Tala called. "Nope, but I sure as hell interrupted his sermon." Then, like that, it stopped. No bullets, no movement, just snow falling soft again. Tala stood, shoulders tight. "They're waiting." Silas nodded. "For morning." She looked at him, voice low. "That's when they'll burn it." He didn't answer. He didn't need to, because she was right. They moved fast, quietly. Tala buried food beneath floorboards. Silas set up the last tripwire by the back door. Every step was soaked in unspoken understanding. When they sat again, close to the dying embers of the stove, the silence between them wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. Tala turned to him. "You don't owe us this." Silas met her gaze, tired but unyielding. "Maybe I don't." "Then why?" He exhaled. "Because somebody should have fought for you before." "I'm just late to the job." She stared at him a moment longer, then reached out and placed her hand over his. calloused meeting calloused. We stand together, then. He nodded once. We stand. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The smoke hadn't started yet, but it would. The enemy would come, bold and righteous, ready to take what didn't belong to them. But inside that weathered cabin stood a man and a woman who'd been broken by the world and still chose to rise. And between them, a child worth every damn bullet. The first torch hit the porch rail just past dawn. No warning, no speech, just flame. It licked the old wood like a starving dog, snapping and curling with greedy fingers. Smoke curled up into the pale winter sky as the second torch sailed. Then the third. Inside the cabin, Silas stood by the doorway, Winchester in hand, eyes cold and unblinking. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. Tala was already at the window, her braided hair swinging as she scanned the tree line. "They're not trying to scare us anymore," she said. "No," Silas replied, calm as a man waiting for his own gallows. "They're done pretending." In the back room, Nima crouched beneath the table, blanket around her, jaw tight with silent bravery. She clutched the small carved horse Silas had whittled for her. The firelight flickered across her face. Tyla knelt beside her. "Listen to me, Mountain Flower," she whispered, tucking a strand of hair behind the girl's ear. "When the back door opens, you run." Nima shook her head. "No." Tala's voice hardened. "You run, straight to the ravine. Follow the stone trail. Stay low. You do not stop. Do you understand me?" Tears welled, but the girl nodded. One tear rolled down her cheek. "I want you to live," Tala said. "You live for both of us." The fire began to bite through the cabin's front, smoke creeping like a serpent through the floorboards. Silas and Tala moved like they'd trained for this all their lives. They hadn't. But pain had taught them plenty. Silas rigged the last of his dynamite by the porch. Just one stick left. Not enough to kill everyone, but maybe enough to scatter the cowards. He turned to Tala. "I'll hold the line. You take her." She shook her head. "You'll die." "I ain't asking for forever. Just enough." A moment passed between them, scorched, sacred. Then she kissed him. Not a farewell, not a promise, just truth. The back door blew open. Tala ran with Nima clutched to her side like a heartbeat, out into the snow, into the brush, away from the smoke. Behind them, gunfire erupted like thunder-splitting stone. Silas stood alone. They came fast, 4 of them, 2 with rifles, 1 with a machete, 1 swinging a rope. He shot the first square in the chest. No hesitation. The man dropped without a sound. The second got off a round that tore into Silas's shoulder, a hot, brutal punch. He staggered but didn't fall. He turned and threw the lit dynamite. The explosion cracked like judgment, hurling wood, snow, and men into the air. It bought them time. Not peace. From the tree line, Tala looked back only once. The cabin was ablaze, flames roaring like an angry god. Smoke blotted out the trees, the sky, the world. She did not see Silas, but she felt him. Like a mountain. Holding. They reached the ravine just as the sun broke free of the clouds. Nima collapsed into the snow, panting, eyes wide and hollow. Tala knelt beside her, chest heaving, throat raw. "You did good," she whispered. The girl didn't answer. She just clutched the carved horse tighter. Later, from the ridge, Tala saw the fire burn itself to ash. The cabin was gone. The men, dead, scattered, or limping away like wounded dogs. But one thing burned brighter than the smoke. Sacrifice. He hadn't done it to be a hero. He'd done it because some lives were worth more than revenge. And as Tala held her daughter and stared into the orange ruin, she didn't cry. She just whispered one word to the wind. Home. The snow didn't fall that morning. It waited, like the land itself was holding its breath. Tala and Nima made camp beneath the ridge, where pine branches hung heavy and low. A thin stream wound through the roots like a silver vein. The wind had shifted, less biting, more hushed. As if even winter knew it had taken too much already. Tala crouched by the fire, feeding it small twigs, careful not to wake the girl. Nima slept beside her, curled in a blanket, her little fists still clutching that wooden horse. Smoke drifted upward in slow spirals, carrying the last warmth from the coals Silas had once burned for them, and Tala just watched it rise. She hadn't spoken since dawn. By midday, the world had softened. The trail behind them was gone, buried under drifting powder. No hoofprints, no blood. Just silence. Tala packed slowly. Her movements were stiff, methodical. Her right hand was burned, her ribs bruised, but none of that mattered now. They were alive. And he wasn't. They reached the old church just before sundown. A crumbling thing made of stone and stubborn faith, perched on a hilltop like a ghost waiting to be remembered. Most of its windows were broken. The bell no longer rang, but the roof still held. And inside, the pews were dry. Nima stepped in first. Her bare feet padded across the dusty floor as she stared up at the faded mural of a man on a cross. She said nothing, just sat down quietly in the first row. Tala stayed near the door. She looked up at the cracked beams and broken glass, then slowly slid down the wall and sat on the cold ground. A long silence stretched between them. Then Nima spoke, her voice small. "Do you think he knew?" Tala looked over. "Knew what?" "That we made it." Tala didn't answer right away. Her throat was thick, her heart heavier than it had ever been, even heavier than the day she ran from her father. She finally nodded. "I think he knew. That's why he stayed." That night, she couldn't sleep. She walked outside, under a sky full of stars, sharper than glass, brighter than firelight. The wind stirred the trees gently, almost kindly. And for the first time in years, Tala cried. Not like a warrior, not like a mother, just like a woman who had loved something too late. She cried until her breath turned raw and her knees gave out beneath her. Then she whispered into the earth, "You were never a bad man, Silas Gant. Just a broken one trying to build something that didn't crumble." In the days that followed, Tala began mending the church. She used what little tools she had to fix the door latch, patch the roof, sweep out the rot. She taught Nima to mix mud for mortar and tie knots from horsehair. They planted wild sage near the entrance. Every dusk, they lit a single candle inside. And every morning, the sun broke through the same broken window in the east, casting light right onto the center of the floor, where a single name had been etched into the stone. Held the line. Nothing else. No date, no title, just that. Some said they saw smoke from the ridge. Saw two figures walking the trail with quiet purpose. Others said a woman lived up there now, one who never spoke of the past, but could tame any wild horse with just her eyes. The children in town whispered stories about the Apache ghost woman and her daughter of fire. And the grown men, well, they remembered Silas Gant. Not for the things he broke, but for the thing he protected. The wind kept blowing. The land kept healing. And somewhere, buried in the bones of the West, was the soft, stubborn truth that sometimes home isn't a place. It's a choice you keep making, even when no one's left to see it. Now ask yourself, If all you had left was one match, one child, and one final breath, would you run? Or would you stay and hold the line?